All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials World podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? We are, of course, in the year 2025 as we've been for the last fucking 6 months now. It's actually almost halfway through the year at this point. And, we are at almost 100 episodes of this show right now. And there's something that we've never really covered before, which is a war movie. Just that badass genre where like cool guys kill an enemy and then you just go hoorah at the end. You know what I mean, Brian?
And you're like, I'm so glad that this is documented so that I can remember all of the freedom that I have and all of the cool guys that had to do these things for me to enjoy all of the freedoms that I enjoy and all of the bright futures that I look forward to here in 2025.
Exactly. And, there's plenty of amazing ones like, Saving fucking Private Ryan and movies like that are obviously very feel-good
Sands of
movies.
Iwo Jima.
Exactly. Movies that are just like, fuck yeah, America. And, there's recently a movie I found out that is a Russian/Belarusian film that is not really that at all. In fact, a lot of people have said the idea of the anti-war movie, right? But you know what? I think this might be the only anti-war movie ever made because all those other movies that claim to be anti-war are just glorifying war. And this movie absolutely is not doing that.
And that is one of the things, before we did our viewing for the week, that was one of the things we were talking about. And I think maybe even part of the reason that neither of us were particularly interested in doing a war movie before. Certainly there are movies about war that I enjoy that aren't perfect. But in America especially, there's a lot of movies that purport to be anti-war that I think genuinely are attempting to, and they really fail for a lot of different reasons. And it's really interesting when you see this movie. It really does not do any of those things that, say, your Full Metal Jacket does.
No, exactly, yeah. So this week I want to review a war movie that is actually an anti-war movie. So this week we're going to review Come and See. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week. Woo! Yeah! All right. And, obviously we're going to be talking about a very depressing film. But you know what, Brian? I want to talk about something far less depressing, which is far-right losers getting convicted of child porn charges. Is that something that is less depressing than Come and See, Brian?
Well, it's a sliding scale, sort of. Far-right losers convicted, not so depressing. Far-right losers alive, kind of a drag. Child porn, not the happiest ever. Sliding scale.
Exactly. So, and actually, he's not been convicted. He's just been charged, to be very clear. But he's
so
probably
we'll
gonna
see.
Get convicted.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. So this week, I want to talk about R.J. May, otherwise known as Robert John May III, which is his legal name. Now, he is a now suspended member of the South Carolina House of Representatives from the 88th District. Interesting. A right-wing Republican from the 88th District of South Carolina.
He moved there. He was, I gotta be here. I gotta be where the action is.
No, exactly. But yeah, so this guy was the founder and vice chairman of the South Carolina Freedom Caucus. So that's really cool. The Freedom Caucus, that thing that's totally legitimate and not fucking backed by billionaires.
Yeah,
Real
they're
thing.
protecting our freedoms, Taylor.
Exactly, 100%. Well, freedoms to post certain things on, I think, Telegram, was that it?
Telegram is so full of, what you'd expect, but specifically
Kick.
right-wing pedophiles. Oh, okay, Kick, which is like their Twitter, right? That's like the Nazi Twitter, or is that Gab?
I think that's Gab.
I get them all mixed up. Okay.
So real quick, on May 27th of last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received a cyber tip from Kick, flagging videos from username, and the username is incredible. It is Joe Biden 69.
Fantastic. Free my man. He's been set up.
Containing child sexual abuse, according to a statement from the United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina.
There are layers to this. It's kind of maybe our guy RJ is doing a little bit of like meta irony, right? Because of course Joe Biden is a pedophile. We know that, but especially the American right wing knows that. They've been saying it for years now. And this is like a guy who is also a pedophile, who is self-aware of in his violation of children, to what picked the username Joe Biden 69. There's a lot of contradictions here, and I'm really having a hard time threading the needle through all of them.
It's so weird. Also, by the way, trying to be epic with your username on a child sex abuse forum is amazing. That's awesome.
It's incredible because it's like, is the joke like, yeah, I'm a pedophile and I'm Joe Biden, who is he's like trying to own Joe Biden through his own pervert behavior.
So yeah, so just a few
it's
more
like
things.
frying my brain to think about.
No, exactly. Yeah. So, and to be clear, like I said, this is all just getting started. He just got, I think, officially charged maybe a few weeks ago as of recording, and court proceedings literally just started this week as of recording. So things are definitely very new in this current criminal proceeding. But I also wanted to mention one more thing, and it's actually relevant to this movie before we get into it. He got his master's at Tel Aviv University.
Of course.
What else is there to say? What else is there to say?
Couldn't be like, yeah.
A Zionist pedophile. A Zionist pedophile.
With an epic anti-Joe Biden name. Yeah.
Yeah, so you know what? The pedocon theory, the Zionist sex offender theory remains undefeated. I will say that remains undefeated.
They are not beating the allegations.
No, they are absolutely not. But, speaking of people who are not beating any allegations, Brian, I think it leads perfectly into our review of Come and See, because this movie allegation is that we should kill Hitler. Well, we'll get into that piece of trivia in a little bit. But either way, so this week we're going to be reviewing Come and See. It came out in 1985, and the first trivia fact I have here is that it was filmed in chronological sequence, which is interesting because, this is a movie that is, especially for its, time and era, was pretty much an epic film in a lot of ways. And there's a pretty, significant weaponry used in this movie, so the fact they were able to film it in that way is pretty wild. It also makes sense to see the degradation of our main character, who starts off as a young, hopeful boy and turns into a damaged, middle-aged man by the end of the movie, essentially. It is really horrifying in a lot of ways. Like, when we call this an anti-war movie, it is the anti-war movie in a lot of ways, like, legitimately.
So let's unpack that right away. Why, when we say there's no other anti-war movie, do we say that? You might listen to this and you might go, oh, of course there's anti-war movies. Full Metal Jacket's about how war is bad. Apocalypse Now is about how war is bad. Of course, there are many movies, some very good movies, that attempt to do that. The issue with portrayals of war, similar sometimes, to be honest, to portrayals of vigilantism, is that because when you make a movie, you have to make it engaging to watch, right? You have to make it exciting. You have to make it something that kind of glues the audience's eyeballs to the screen. Particularly in American cinema, the way to do that is to make things look cool. That makes a movie really entertaining. That makes a movie easier to watch, makes it more digestible. And you might think, oh, I'll make some things in this movie really entertaining, really cool. That's going to get more asses in seats, and then more people see Full Metal Jacket, which is this movie about the dehumanization of the training process and then the kind of tribalism of when you're overseas at war. No. What happens then is that the people who are already there to take that from your movie, people who are leftists or liberals or just people that don't like war, they will get that message to a degree. The people that you are bringing into your war movie, the butts you're putting in seats, they will not retain that. They're going to see the exciting action. They're going to see the gunfighter fights. They're going to see the gunfire. They're going to see the cool military iconography, which is for a lot of people is what they remember. And really any action scene, that is what will stick with them. One of the things that might be really jarring to American audiences is there are no battles in it for a movie about war. That doesn't really exist in the sense that Americans think about it. Any of the things that you would see in Full Metal Jacket where, you see them in their cool military gear and you see their cool guns, there is no point at Come and See where we get to linger on that because the filmmakers are acutely aware that when you flashpoint that iconography, that it only dilutes your message.
No, absolutely, yeah. And once we get to the synopsis here, the horror of this movie is really eminent in the fact that it's, like I said, an anti-war movie. Yeah, you're right. There really is no glorification of violence. It's all very depraved. And then speaking of depraved entities, so this movie was not rated by the MPA. It was directed by Elem Klimov, and the screenplay was by Alice Adamovich and Elem Klimov once again. Now, Alice Adamovich was a Belarusian activist, writer, advocate for liberalization of the Soviet Union, which, we'll certainly talk about later on to a certain extent, was not the most positive era of modern Russia. I think we could say the 90s was a pretty bad decade for Russia in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, we won't get into that right now. But either way, so Alice Adamovich was once again, he was Belarusian, and he actually was a partisan during this time period. Now, to be clear, I don't think he experienced all the things that were portrayed in this movie, but at the same time, obviously, he was a young man, about 15, 16-year-old during this time period, which was arguably one of the worst worst time periods to be a child in human history, I would say. Pretty categorically, a pretty
Yeah.
bad time and place to be a fucking child.
Just absolutely no moment where you actually are able to transition from your childhood to adulthood because you are constantly, not just you, but your loved ones and everyone around you is constantly under threat. And you kind of just have adulthood thrust onto you. You are just sort of forced into it immediately. And every moment you are not acting as an adult, you could potentially die, or everyone you love could potentially die.
Exactly. It's very, very tragic. And then as well, Elem Klimov, who was the director of this movie, and he actually was from Stalingrad and had to flee Stalingrad on like a fucking like raft on the river that Stalingrad is on the Volga River, I believe. That's where he had to flee from during the Battle of Stalingrad, which I believe is still the deadliest battle in human history, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. And of course, the Soviet Union incurred something like 80% of the Allied losses in World War II, armed losses, not necessarily civilian losses, although a lot of civilian losses too. A bad time and a really pivotal moment in kind of determining how the Soviet Union and the rest of the Western world would develop is directly out of the trauma of World War II and those specific conflicts. That really did kind of shape like the rest of geopolitics, and we're kind of still dealing with that now.
No, absolutely. And then Elem Klimov was once again a Soviet and Russian filmmaker. He's most famous in the West for this film, and this was also his last film before he passed away, although he passed away almost 20 years later after this film. But he felt like this was like the apotheosis of his film career, so he didn't feel like making another movie after this, essentially. And once again, Alice Adamovich, as I mentioned once again, was a Soviet Belarusian writer, screenwriter, literary critic, and democratic activist. And he was most well known in the film world for writing this film, as well as, like I said, writing a lot of articles. And he was also a big advocate for the liberalization, openness of Russia and the Soviet Union. And this movie is about 142 minutes long. I was not able to find a budget because, this was a Soviet film. So needless to say, the budgets weren't really an open thing to find. But this movie did gross about $21 million internationally. And on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 90% critic score and a 96% audience score. So both critics and audiences liked this film. And I do believe, from last time I checked, it is the third highest rated movie on Letterboxd. So this is a movie that people tend to like, and film critics and audiences tend to find a lot of meaning in, which I think you and I, Brian, can both agree that we do like this film quite a bit, even though it is very unpleasant to watch.
It's incredible. One of the things that strikes me when I watch it is how clearly this is a very highbrow movie. It's very critically acclaimed. Of course, a lot of films that came out of the USSR, there really is an emphasis on kind of like high art, on the potential of cinema as art. That's not all they made, but a lot of films got a lot of attention and a lot of budget, a lot of distribution. They tend to be more on that end. But with this movie, well, it has all of those elements. And of course, it is in like traditions of different kind of Eastern European and Russian art movements. It is very watchable. I don't think a war movie like this would ever be made in America. I just don't think that we have the cultural context to even really imagine it. It's so different from how our film studios, even our independent film studios, perceive war films. But it makes sense to me that a lot of people in the West have seen this and appreciated it just because it's very watchable. At about 2.5 hours long, it doesn't feel like you're watching a daunting kind of art film. It's very unpleasant, but it's very cinematic, and it really does move along. It doesn't feel like a movie for like the elite, like art house critics. Not to me, anyways.
No, I totally agree with that. And especially, even though once again, this movie doesn't glorify violence, but this movie's obviously extremely violent. But there's a specific scene at the tail end of the movie that like even like the hoity-toity art house crowd were probably very uncomfortable by. I mean, there's a lot of those scenes of violence, but there's one in particular that like is like, oh, I'm going to go see a movie about the devastation of war. And they watch it and they're like, yeah, I don't know if this one's for me.
Yeah, it actually is about that. That's part of, I think, the thing when I say I don't think you get an American war film like this is it's not, I mean, obviously there's a lot of physical violence and degradation told out in this film, but it is like about the emotional scars on both like a person, on a child of war, and on like a nation of war. It's the idea of growing up in war, not just experiencing it or fighting in it, but that's like the reality that you are growing up into.
No, absolutely, yeah. And I think that leads perfectly into our synopsis here. So, in 1943, Flyora, played by Alexei Kravchenko, and another Belarusian boy dig up a rifle from a trench to join the Soviet partisans. They do so in defiance of their village elder, who warns them that this would arouse the suspicions of occupying Germans. The boys' activities are noticed by FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft. Now, these first few minutes are interesting because, once again, it's just two boys playing out in, like, a fucking sand pit or whatever, like a mud pit, digging up a rifle, and they're like, we're gonna go go fight the Nazis. And then you hear the plane going by, and it's literally Hitler's speeches playing as audio. And then the title card comes up. And so it's like, you know exactly like the fucking mood that this film is about to like conjure up. Like these two kids playing innocently, and then a person whose job it literally is to do reconnaissance to find innocent civilians to murder playing Hitler speeches, and then the title card happens. Like it's a very disturbing foreshadowing about what's going to happen.
It does some pretty heavy disambiguation. This movie, not subtle. It's very clear what its point is at all times. At least I think so. There's probably people online who have argued that it doesn't or something, but very much a film that is going to put what it's saying right in your face for you to accept or not.
Yes, and a lot of people, and we will certainly get to that to the Amazon review section, because I did give you a fair warning, Brian. These Amazon reviews were dog shit. They're awful. Just a real hint, Brian. There were a lot of people complaining that this was a propaganda movie. I'll just say that.
Everything made in the Soviet Union is propaganda, and nothing made outside of it is. The U.S. has never made propaganda. Like, yeah, art came out of the Soviet Union. It was inhabited by human beings who experienced the whole of human emotion, and they lived lives, and they had jobs, and they made art. And you know what? You can like things like the USSR as a state did, and you can not like things it did, but people lived there. They were human beings. They
exactly.
weren't fucking aliens who churned out like
with a different
robot
perspective
propaganda
on the world. They had different perspectives on the world, and even if you do or disagree with it or don't disagree with it, they were still fucking human beings at the end of the day. Like, seriously. And there were people trying to create...
They're capable of making and expressing something, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. The next day, partisans arrive at Flyora's house to conscript him against his mother's wishes. Flyora is taken to a partisan camp in the forest where he becomes a low-rank militiaman who performs menial tasks. When those partisans trained to fight leave, their commander Kosach, played by, this is I think, Lithuanian name.
Just go for it.
My best.
Just go for it.
Lee Bemorius Lasavicius. That was the best I could do. That was a hard one. Orders Flyora and several other men to remain behind at the camp. Bitterly disappointed, Flyora walks into the forest weeping. He comes across Glasha, played by Olga Mironeva, an emotionally unstable adolescent girl working as a partisan nurse. And this character is interesting because she's a very, like, Greek drama figure in a lot of ways, I would say.
Exactly. Thank you.
So she's not meant to be a realistic portrayal. I mean, obviously, this is a person who's experiencing mental breakdown, so that part's fucking realistic. But this character is clearly meant to be, like, a dramatic, and even overly dramatic representation of the horrors that she's beginning to experience as being part of this partisan group.
Well, and also that, like, Fiora encounters her while going through his, like, disappointment of being left behind. Like, she's kind of, at this point, embodying something he hasn't really seen yet.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
he is kind of, like, hinting towards this reality that he's about to, like, be pushed into.
No, exactly, 100%. The forest is then suddenly attacked by dive bombers and German paratroopers, forcing the two to flee. Later, Flyora and Glasha travel to his village, only to find it deserted. Denying that his family is dead, Flyora believes they are hiding on a nearby island across a bog and runs off. Now, this part... Oh, here we are. Glasha follows by chance, seeing a pile of executed villagers behind his house. And that's the thing. They go back to his village, they see, like, rotting food on the table, they eat, they look exhausted, obviously, because, you know, they fucking basically ran away from this partisan group. You know, I don't know if intentionally, but either way, they ran away. Obviously, they're fucking young people. And then they see, like, the pile of dead bodies in front of his house. You know, he has an emotional breakdown. He goes through the bog, you know, disassociating, thinking he can, you know, save his family and his, you know, relatives and villagers and all that. And then this is the moment where the movie, like, really starts becoming, like, the fever dream that people describe this movie as. Because it gets into the surreality of what this character is going through. Like, and then he sees, like, people, like, you know, crowding around him and begging him to, like, to save them and, you know, come back to fight. He tries killing himself, which fails. It's a very rough scene to watch, obviously, as many of these scenes are.
Well, and when you talk about the surreality, one of the things with this film in particular, we were talking about how people have a hard time conceptualizing that the Soviet Union or other existing or former socialist countries, you know, communist countries, whatever, made art. That there's, like, thriving art there. Not the time or place to get into all the mechanics of this. There are long traditions, particularly in the USSR, of, like, various art movements that, yeah, were often state-sponsored. Maybe not unabashedly or without any sort of oversight, but you see in this movie kind of two twin parallels parallels of what are probably the two strands of the Soviet, or Eastern European art that Americans are most familiar with, which is deconstruction of social realism. Social realism, for anyone listening, is when you see those Soviet murals, when you see the statues of the Kims in North Korea, when you see any of these very realistic, hyper dignified looking pictures of people in socialist countries looking very strong and very proud, and it's meant to reflect like the power of the workers or the power of like the socialist movement. Of course, that actually predates the Soviet Union, but it became like kind of the de facto art style of that movement. What you see in this with its hyperrealism, and I don't know if I think this is intentional or not, but it's sort of in that tradition of like we're capturing a moment of like how people lived, and it's hyper realist, which does come out of kind of like the post-romantic movement, comes out of like modernity, these artists that have the ability to capture realism. So we're taking this tradition of like what would be social realism, and we're replicating things that you don't want to see, the things that you usually don't want people to see or you don't want people to have to experience. Coupled with that, there's a long history, particularly in the Soviet Union, but in most existing or formerly existing communist countries, surrealist art, which most people in America I think aren't aware of, but there's this sort of intellectual tradition of like surrealism and Dadaism, kind of futurism, Cubo-futurism especially, sort of running counter to, quote-unquote bourgeois ideals, kind of being a revolutionary art movement. So, particularly in the first, like, half of the 20th century, early Leninist era into the Stalinist era, you get a lot of surrealist art from the Soviet Union in its films and its paintings and its animation, because that's considered like an anti-capitalist art form. I think you see a lot of that, both of those coming back in kind of fractured ways in this movie. You've, of course, got this hyper-realism of like the horrors of war, which reflects social realism, but you've also got, again, this fever dream thing, this disassociative feeling. The camera work in this film kind of is separate from the narrative. It kind of just is like a fly on the wall. Doesn't really contextualize anything for you. It just shows you events, which is sort of a very avant-garde concept. But again, instead of making that sort of this fantastical surrealism, it's sort of meant to demonstrate, I guess, mental illness or severe trauma.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, once we get to the, I think, most infamous scene in this movie, I think it's very much the culmination of that. And there's definitely some of that at the end of this movie, too. But yeah, I definitely want to expound upon that at the very end, though, too. But I definitely like you mentioning all these things because obviously, like, once again, before we get to the Amazon reviews, I complain about a lot of things. But, like, once again, the idea that people say this is like a propaganda film, which, every
That's
movie
incredibly
has...
disrespectful.
No, it is. But, every movie has a message to a certain extent, right? Like, the original title of this movie, as I think you mentioned in the chat just a little while ago, it was going to be called Kill Hitler. You know what I mean? Like, this movie has like an ideological purpose to a certain extent, as any movie technically does.
But any movie does.
Yeah, exactly. Any movie, any piece of art does. And to definitely diminish it as just another piece of propaganda when this movie has obviously an intense amount of critical merit, artistic merit, I should say, is incredibly stupid and naive, I would say.
Pretty xenophobic. I almost said racist, which isn't quite the right word.
Ooh. Well, Brian, we'll certainly get into that in the Amazon reviews too, because that certainly comes up as well. I will just say that. Trust me, dude, the Amazon reviews were dog shit. I was so mad at the Amazon reviews. I would say in the top 5 easily dumbest I've ever seen for this show. I'm not even joking. They were garbage dog shit. They were terrible. Even the positive reviews were dumb.
Belarusian movie about how Nazis are bad. Okay, but do they talk about how the communists are bad at all too? Seems a little
Brian,
one-sided. I know. I can already fucking guess what it is. Oh my god.
So real quick, about halfway through the synopsis here. So a gentleman by the name of Rubej, played by Vladis Bogdanas, a partisan fighter, whisks them away from this village that he's from. Rubej then takes Flora and two other men to raid a warehouse for food. The group find the warehouse unexpectedly guarded by German troops and are forced to retreat. Rubej and Flora's 2 comrades are killed by a landmine. Rubej and Flora coerce a Nazi collaborating farmer to hand over his cow, but a German machine kills Rubej and the cow. Now, interestingly enough about this German collaborator, so he was part of the Belarusian Home Guard. That's what I looked up on Wikipedia. And interestingly enough, Brian, the Belarusian Home Guard, which was the army, well, quote-unquote army of the Nazi puppet government of Belarus, the leader of that Belarus puppet state, he later fled and moved to America, and he died on the west coast of Michigan in one of the blackest cities in the United States. What a weird end to a fascist collaborator.
Yeah, what was going on in those last few years of his life? Like, we need to know.
He literally lived in like a 90+% like black city, and he died. Like, why? It's the most inconspicuous place for him to be. I just don't understand. So either way, rest in piss to that loser. Unfortunately, he lived 30 years after the war, unfortunately, so he got to live at least a long life after that, but, whatever. Flyora attempts to steal a horse and cart from another man to transport the cow, but he convinces Flyora to hide his gun in the Red Army jacket as SS troops appear. He takes Flyora to his house in a village. Now, here is where the real infamous scene happens in this movie. So they go to this village. He's like, hey, come to this village, whatever. It's a safe haven. Well, that's when the German troops and collaborators show up. They occupy the village. They take all the women and children, and they separate some of the men who they were seeing as useful as, once again, more Nazi collaborators, or, they might, I think one of them speaks German or something, but either way, they take all the people that they would consider undesirables, put them in the barn, throw a Molotov cocktail, set it on fire, and destroy everybody in that barn. Now, real quick, before we continue on the synopsis, I do want to mention what the basis for this was, because this did happen a lot in Belarus. It happened in Poland, it happened in Czechoslovakia, but Belarus, particularly in World War II, was hit extremely hard, easily by percentage the most hard-hit nation out of any nation in World War II. In fact, there are estimates that around 25% of Belarus were killed in the conflict, and around another 25% were forced to leave Belarus. So something like half of the country's population either died or was exiled. That's how bad this conflict was for Belarus. It is unbelievable the amount of devastation and violence. And this type of violence happened pretty regularly by, once again, Belarusian Home Guard and other Nazi collaborators, and I would say most infamously the Dirlewanger Brigade. Now, Brian, have you heard of the Dirlewanger Brigade?
I have. The ones that the Nazis had to chill out? Is that them?
Yep. It was one of two groups that the SS told to chill out. Well, to be fair, the Dirlewangers were SS, but they were considered by far the most extreme SS battalion.
They sent him up to Belarus because they didn't want to see him, right? Essentially,
yeah. And in fact, the Dirlewanger Brigade was so extreme that even in some instances, they killed each other trying to loot other people. They were just the most monstrous people in World War II, and that's saying something. They were so bloodthirsty that they killed each other to loot more than they could have done collaborating. That is how monstrous these people were. It was a SS battalion made up of a literal convicted child molester and poacher, and he got other convicted criminals
but an SS battalion with a child molester who's also a poacher, that could be any SS battalion. That doesn't narrow it down at all, really.
Well, to be fair, though, he was one of the few that was actually convicted of it. He actually was sent to a concentration camp due to his conviction.
So they must have really hated him.
Well, actually, there were calls within the SS to be hey, can we arrest this guy again and get him kicked out?
And he's creeping me out.
And apparently, high-ranking SS officials were nah, he's doing fine. He's killing everybody that needs to be killed. Yeah, it was bad. So this type of barn thing and
well, he's just one of the many victims of communism, Taylor.
Oh, we will certainly get into that.
All
with
of these poor victims of communism that were in World War II that they killed, that I don't know why they would have killed.
We will certainly get into that in one of the Amazon reviews because they mentioned that explicitly, Brian. But either way, so yeah, just a real quick history lesson. This stuff absolutely happened. There's another movie. It was a Mel Gibson movie where they portrayed that, and that absolutely did not happen. They did that in, I can't remember which fucking Mel Gibson movie. It was about the American Revolution, and it's British troops absolutely did not do that. There's no evidence for that. You're literally referencing something the Dirlewanger Brigade did in fucking Belarus and Poland and Czechoslovakia.
I wonder why Mel Gibson learned about that, by the way.
Yeah! Brian, him and his friends had some very interesting ideas they wanted to share with each other.
He was boy, this is really crazy, interesting stuff. It would really suck if someone did this to me.
Yeah. And then, yeah, so once again, basically everybody dies except for Flyora and a couple other, useful people to this Nazi battalion. And then you see a young woman getting dragged off and, we'll get into that very, very shortly at the end of what they do to her, but it's pretty obvious what they're going to fucking do to her. And then there's another moment that I think is maybe one of the most, I guess, infamous screenshots from this movie, which is the soldier holding a gun up to his head and taking a picture for, good time's sake, which, of course, is something that also happened during this conflict. There's so many pictures of atrocities where people are just smiling and laughing.
And
where there's
many,
a dead
many
body
wars.
going on.
Any war since photography has become accessible, you can find that, unfortunately.
Well, we can talk about the IDF taking pictures with fucking lingerie and hanging out and bombed out fucking buildings in Gaza.
Fucking on their TikTok, lip syncing while they raid Palestinian women's drawers.
Yeah, it's fucking nasty. It is unfortunately a part of any war and conflict, but like once again, that is absolutely stuff that happens. So like, if you think like, oh, this movie is just showing violence for the sake of violence. No, no, this shit happened. This shit fucking happened. Maybe not in this exact portrayal, in this exact moment in time, in this exact day and place, but it absolutely motherfucking happened.
Also, though, like, as you were saying, Taylor, if you want, and of course, the people saying that this is Soviet propaganda or whatever don't give a shit about this. The person that made it was essentially a reformist, which, again, you can feel however you feel about that. But the criticism that this is some one sided, like, Stalinist portrayal of World War II era events that's unfair to the fucking Nazis or whatever doesn't even make sense because this wasn't made by someone who was, like, an ML, you know?
Totally. As I mentioned earlier, the writer of this film, Alice Adamovich, he was, and you mentioned him, obviously, he was a reformer. And real quick, his grandfather was sent to Siberia under Stalin. Like, that already should tell you that he's not some fucking, like, ML tanky stereotype that liberals like to fucking claim that anybody on the left wing is. On top of it, too, he also helped found a center-right Belarusian, like, political party and advocacy group. Obviously talk about the liberalization. He was also a really big supporter of Boris Yeltsin in the early days. I mean, he died in 1994, so it's not like he knew what Yeltsin would fuck it up to in the later years. But, it's one of those things where obviously a lot of liberal Russians are people who are at least advocates of liberalizing and democratizing the Soviet Union. Like, in those early days, they probably were somewhat hopeful, even if the beginning of it was a little shaky. So, like, I don't blame him for that. But no, totally.
Right.
He's not some, like ML tanky stereotype. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. And I guess that's the thing. I mean, I'm guessing with these reviews that it's mostly, like, American people on the right and not that many. Well, I mean, so they're all on the right. I mean, conservatives as opposed to liberals. But then I also think, like, I don't even know if Americans, and this is going to make me sound so pretentious here, do you think most Americans would know how to watch this movie? Just like we said, what is a war movie to us? It's a movie that is vaguely about war being bad in a best case scenario, but still looks really cool. And it's still kind of fantastical and still kind of funny. That's one of the big things with Full Metal Jacket, with Apocalypse Now. Both great movies. Both movies I very much enjoy, but say I'm a fan of, is that they add this dark comedy element and this kind of like tongue-in-cheek element to it that's very dilutes the attempted anti-war message, right? What is an American viewer like when I watch this? Not saying that I understand any better. How do I feel about this? This movie makes me feel deeply uncomfortable, which is of course the point. But like there is no other reference point for Americans. You can't watch this and go, maybe Apocalypse Now with some of the weird Marlon Brando dialogue at the end where he's talking about like killing people, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the closest thing I can think of to an American analog to this is like fucking Schindler's List or something. Like that's the closest I can think of. So just to finish up the synopsis here. So after the barn burning scene, Flyoura wanders away from the scorched village, finding the aftermath of a partisan ambush on the escaping Germans. Flyoura recovers his jacket and rifle only to spot the woman who was, once again dragged away, and she was of course sexually assaulted, bleeding and stumbling in a fugue state. He finds the partisans nearby having captured some of the Germans and their collaborators responsible for the church fire. They plead for their lives, blaming a fanatical and unapologetic Obersturmführer. And this scene's interesting too because this is a scene that reminds me of, I can't remember which movie it is. It's an early Kubrick movie. You were just talking about Full Metal Jacket earlier. Paths of Glory. Have you seen Paths of Glory, Brian?
No, I need to. I have not seen Paths of Glory.
So that is a movie that I would say is another interesting American analog that I think people could argue is an anti-war film. Now, to be fair, it does have an incredible battle sequence that is still one of the best battle sequences of any movie I've ever seen, and it was made in like the fucking 50s. Like, it's genuinely incredible. But that movie
that's one of the only Kubrick movies I haven't seen yet.
It's really, really good. I'd recommend it. So the movie starts off with the battle. After the battle is a failure. It's a movie about like the French in World War I, essentially. And after the battle is a failure, they basically find a couple guys and they're gonna, decimate them in the Roman concept of decimation, right? Where they take some random losers and they blame them for the reason it failed and then they execute them. And the whole movie is essentially them like having to plead their case that they weren't the ones that caused this. And like the sergeant or whatever is basically arguing that like, no, you can't do this. These guys are fine. And then, the high commander like, but we have to set an example, blah, blah. Like that's an example of a movie that I can think of that is probably close to another American anti-war analog. But I think the problem with that movie, even though it is a great movie, is that the war scene is so good and it's so engaging that it once again takes away the horror that we experience throughout the rest of the movie in a lot of ways. It's like a pre-Saving Private Ryan like battle scene. It's incredible.
Saving Private Ryan, of course, one of the most repugnant movies ever made. Also really bad after that opening scene. So what do we say, just for any listeners, just so we're clear? Taylor and I aren't claiming that Kubrick or Coppola or whoever aren't trying to make pro-war films or that they're like fascist. I could claim, I guess, that they're ambiently fascist in the way that all American films. If I really wanted to be an asshole, asshole. But it's about the portrayal of war. How do you portray war in a way that doesn't look cool? That is even a problem. I'm going to tell you a story here. We've talked a few times about Paul Verhoeven on the show, just as an example, about how Starship Troopers, one of the greatest American anti-fascist films ever. Like, right? We could agree about that. My dad, my father, who also is my father and I love very much, but is pretty fucking right-wing, is a veteran and just loves war movies. One of his top 5 movies ever is Starship Troopers. And I would watch it with him and I'd be like, why does he like this? It's like making fun of him. He does not care. He does not care because it fucking looks cool, and all the shit that looks cool reaffirms all those feelings in him. And that's how the average person sees even like Full Metal Jacket, which maybe to the listener or to Taylor or I seems very obviously like an anti-war film. But most people, even if they can kind of logically understand that this is saying quote unquote war is hell, their real takeaway from it, I think, is going to be like on an emotional level, the cool action things, even though there's not that much of that in Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah, exactly. And the other takeaway from Full Metal Jacket is that Arlie Ermey is funny and an asshole. That's the other takeaway from fucking Full Metal Jacket to a lot of people. And, that's the thing about, Full Metal Jacket, though, right? Is that, like, talk about, obviously, it is an anti-war film to some people, and we can certainly see that. But what is the thing that most people know about movies like Full Metal Jacket and Starship Troopers? Like, Full Metal Jacket is, Pyle is a fucking idiot, and Arlie Ermey is funny and based and awesome. But he's an asshole at the same time, and he got his comeuppance. But that's, like, the ultimate, like, fucking meme about this movie. Like,
yeah,
the fact of the matter is, like, most people don't remember the second half of Full Metal Jacket that much in comparison to the first half of the movie.
When actually the reality is that Arlie Ermey sucks and Gomer Pyle is the hero of that movie for shooting him and then shooting himself. He does what every sergeant should do.
He does anti-fascist action. He was the first Antifa.
For real though, Republicans love Arlie Ermey and Full Metal Jacket, and it's like, what?
No, absolutely. And then also, of course, with, Starship Troopers, the fact that there's, killing of bugs and they're so badass, even though they get fucking, maimed the whole time. And there's also just hot, young, Aryan-looking people, essentially, who are dumb as shit.
Verhoeven made the satire as unsubtle as he possibly could. He literally modeled the cinematography of that movie after, like, Goebbels, right? Like, Goebbels
exactly,
rules for filmmaking. And people just did not care.
Well, and also the last scene, Neil Patrick Harris is literally wearing an SS uniform. Like, it's so
literally.
unsubtle. So, but either way, in this movie, so the Nazi collaborators and the Nazis, they get killed by the partisans. And then the final scene of this movie is Flora seeing a picture of Hitler, which in, I think, Belarusian or Russian, I can't remember. It's actually titled Hitler the Liberator, which...
Hitler the Liberator, yeah.
It's like liberating their lives from living, I guess. But yeah, either way, whatever. And then talk about the movie title originally wanting to be Killing Hitler. So this is the scene where he literally kills Hitler by shooting the picture a million times with flashbacks of Hitler's speeches. And there's also just momentary showings of like Holocaust footage. It's very morbid ending to this movie that's already very morbid. And interestingly enough, though, too, the thing that makes him stop shooting is a picture that's superimposed of 2 different pictures of both Clara Hitler, who is Hitler's mom, and Hitler as a baby. It's wild. It's a wild scene. Talk about once again, talk about the surrealism. Like, it is a very surreal scene of this child shooting a picture of Hitler and then seeing a child and a mother and then stopping. It's wild.
There's a few different reads on this scene. So my interpretation of this scene, what I think the film intends is that, there's always this hypothetical of like killing baby Hitler or whatever, right? It's like a fun classic thought experiment that we've all done. I think the point we're saying here is if you could kill Hitler, if you could kill baby Hitler, let's say in the midst of the war, you kill Hitler, you cannot undo all of the trauma. You cannot undo the wheels of history that these atrocities have set in motion. Like, our protagonist cannot undo the trauma that he's undergone, even if he were to like kill Hitler somehow. Today I was reading some different takes on this film, and I saw a take that really annoyed me, which to me felt very much like a Western liberal read on the film, which was, the protagonist is just a young boy and he's traumatized by war and turned into sort of a hardened killer. And the truth is that Hitler had to start as just a young boy too, so like maybe we're not all that different. Very annoying take, feels to me very Western, but a pretty common interpretation of this film that I saw. I actually do think, probably to the chagrin of both the Western liberals and to the filmmakers, that there is a more hardline Marxist-Leninist read on this ending that you could make, which is that your hesitation to act in those pivotal moments, basically that the answer would be yes to kill baby Hitler, right? But to seize that moment in history where you can stop these things before they start. Of course, this is all started by the time we meet our character, by the time the film starts. There's nothing that this young boy could have done to stop these things from happening. But it's this idea that is very post-war Soviet of like the remnants of fascism need to be like eradicated. The very memory of them needs to be a shudder and kind of like a stifling of vomit in your throat, and it needs to be like an eradication of everything that they were able to kind of grow out of, right? A killing of the soil that fascism sprouts out of. That in the wake of the atrocities done to Eastern Europe, to really the world by fascism, you need to obliterate any trace of them. I don't think that's the filmmaker's intention, but I think it would be pretty easy for a Belarusian audience or anyone really in the Eastern Bloc watching this film to maybe draw that conclusion from this ending as well.
No, absolutely. I couldn't have fucking said it better myself.
Plus the fact that it was going to be called Kill Hitler.
Yeah, no, exactly. But also, and to be clear, you obviously talked about, the sort of, and I think I get what you're kind of saying is the Western view is that vengeance bad, basically. That's the whole,
kind of, yeah.
That.
Well, which war makes us all into Hitler.
Well, and that's the thing is that there is a piece of media that has really just sat very poorly with me since I engaged with it about 5 years ago. And I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's already been talked about and done to death. But I want to talk about it for just one moment here. So there's a video game out there called The Last of Us Part 2. Are you familiar with it, Brian?
I know the title of it. I don't play new video games or contemporary video games now.
That's very true. But real quick, so The Last of Us Part 2 is a game where essentially the first game is about a guy who essentially saves a girl who he sees as like the embodiment of his daughter who died like 20 years earlier in the apocalypse or whatever, right? And the sequel is him getting murdered by another person and his daughter figure, his adopted daughter figure, essentially, going out and committing revenge and committing just unspeakable acts of revenge to, basically feel some catharsis after she watched her father figure die. And the whole point of the game is that she commits these horrible violence. The other person who killed her dad figure also commits horrible violence. You just watch this violence degradation. At the very end of the game, like, they get to this point where they're just, hell has happened. Everybody's been murdered. Everyone they love has been, like, fucking killed or ran away from them, basically. And at the very end, they're like, I can't do this violence, no. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, so we watch this horrible degradation of violence, and at the very end, they're like, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. And then they just walk away. And it's interesting about it, Brian, is that
very profound.
Would you believe the writer and creator of that video game grew up in a West Bank settlement? It was an Israeli settler. And he got the idea to write this game after watching IDF soldiers get murdered and him being mad about it. I'm not even joking.
Come the fuck on.
I'm
They're
dead
soldiers.
serious.
They're soldiers. I'm not trying to be glib here. Not even civilians. They're IDF soldiers. They're occupying soldiers. Sorry, not the time or the place.
Even if you consider the, hypothetical and air quotes legitimacy of the state of Israel, they were in the settlements. Those aren't even legal by any standard.
Yeah.
So either way, like when I first played that game,
it's bad when people do it against his people.
Vengeance bad. And like I've always been anti-Zionist to a certain extent, but like even when I played this game, like this game really doesn't sit very well with me. And then I learned that factoid. I'm like, oh, now I get it. Now,
like the key turning in the lock.
Yeah, it's like, goddamn, now I figured it out, Jesus. But either way, so enough about the horrors of real world, Brian. Let's get into the horrors of online world. So let's get to these Amazon reviews, Brian. They're really bad. As I keep saying, they're really bad. Honestly, I was like screaming at some of these Amazon reviews because they were so bad. I was seething. I was coping hard. So our first Amazon review here is the most based Amazon review I found, and that's saying something. I mean, this is a based lib, a very dumb based lib, but this is a based lib, and this is the most based person I could find. So our first review is from Guitar Man, who gives us 5 stars.
Awesome. We love him.
And the head of the review says, "War is hell." And the body of the review says, "The life of a young soul in the fight against the evil Republicans. Oh, sorry, Nazis, with their fellow Russians leading a helping hand.
Pa, 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 pa.
So much carnage at such a your age." I think they meant young age, but they put your age. "The blank stares, the ruthlessness of the Nazis abusing, killing, raping, and every evil deed you can imagine in a war that will never be forgotten. This film will bring to the individual who was too young to be there a story that will make you want to do everything in your power to stop war at any cost. The military-industrial machine can stand this. Then what does that say about them and those who are brought in Washington to support the purchase of extremely overpriced killing devices? If you don't like my position, then what does that say about you?"
What did, like, Jello Biafra write this?
God bless our men/women in uniform. Unfortunately, it will
What?
always be there if there are military war devices to be sold and millions to be made. Listen, all right, this is the most liberal thing I've ever seen in my entire life. He's like, God bless the
Yeah.
troops, but we will have troops until the military-industrial complex is destroyed. What? What, bro?
Yeah, what? So as long as the military-industrial complex exists, we may as well support the troops because they didn't choose to be there or anything.
It's very liberal, and you know what? This is the least harmful person in this. I want to be very clear. So that says something.
All right, buddy.
And then our next review here, Brian, is the review that, like, I legitimately was like, I was taken aback by the header. And I told you this is the one that you are not ready for. I promise you're not ready for the header. This is the most, like, gobsmacking header to a review I've ever seen on Amazon for anything we've ever covered. Like, this shit's crazy. So hold on your asshole, Brian. This one's rough. So our next 5-star review here is from Justin Kidd, who says, whenever I think or hear white privilege, I now think of this movie.
No, 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 no. Oh no.
It doesn't go where you think it's going to go, Brian, either, which is hilarious. It's so good.
All right, continue.
Put simply, this is one of the most chilling and frightening films I've ever watched. You don't have to be able to speak Russian to feel the impact either, which is the reality that isn't so much a story and more of a telling. And just when you think you might reach some sort of comfort zone with what you're witnessing, you're brought to yet another sickening reality, followed by historical footage of that very reality. And you're like, okay, not too bad so far. It's, not really saying a whole lot, but fair enough.
Sure.
And then the final paragraph is so funny. As a minority living and growing up in America and watching this, I cannot emphasize how lucky I feel to have grown up the way I have in the place that I did. This film gives a glimpse into a reality I hope no one, even my enemies, never have to live. And you know what? That's also another fine enough paragraph. But I went to this person's Amazon reviews and I found a picture of them, and I'm not going to obviously link this, but it's a picture of him and his children, and he is a black man with half green and black hair with his biracial children and his white wife. And I'm like, of course, this guy wrote this fucking review. Of course.
Oh, come on, man. Come on. Like, I don't know. I don't want to, like, pick on, I don't know. His experience is his experience and whatever. But it's like, who are you trying to impress, man? Why do you have to write that? Like, what is the point of this? He's saying, like, oh, it turns out some bad things have happened to white people, too. Trust me, I know, man.
Trust me, I know as a black man married to a white woman. It's like, bro, what?
What if his friends is, like, talking about, like, systemic racism in the U.S., and he's like, well, I don't know. I was just watching this movie about Belarus in World War II. Not always so great for the white people.
Yeah, when I saw that header, I'm like, no motherfucking way.
Well, but I
have
was
to include
expecting.
this.
Why is that your header for your review of this movie? That's the most prominent thought in your head when you're watching this.
Yeah, it's very dumb, but I'm just like, that is incredible, dude. Like, holy shit, you know how to sell a motherfucking review, dude.
Yeah, he got his fucking hook in my jaw.
Yeah. It's Amazon clickbait.
Oh my god, fucking king. Both of these guys fucking rule so far.
Yeah, really right. Well, speaking of characters, so our next review here is from Fizzle, who gives us 4 stars. And the head of the review says, a rare portrayal at rarely mentioned acts of the Nazis. Now, I don't agree with that. I think a lot of the things in this movie have been very much portrayed Nazi war crimes. Like, I think these Nazi war crimes have been very well portrayed in movies. But you know what? It's maybe to a more extreme element than we've seen in a lot of movies. I will give you that. And then the body of the review says, here or there, in this person, I don't think English is their first language, but either way. Here or there is the absence of many elements that you may come to expect is a story about struggle against the Nazi invasion. The Nazi soldiers are not polished with perfect dentistry. They are not portrayed as the move, orderly, and efficient, passionless killers. And it's like, I mean, in some ways, I think in some movies they portray them in a little too supervillainy, but like in a lot of movies they portray them as brutes too. I mean, I don't really know about that. I mean, that's part of the whole like quote-unquote propaganda element of showing the Nazis as like just ruthless monsters, I guess. The film depicts the looting, raping, and sadist glee and enjoyment with destroying people, but also shows their buck passing and innocence claiming when caught, which is true. Because like, even monsters, once again, when their back is put against the wall, they will do anything to get out of it. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of fucking like Durlwanger guys who are caught and like begged for their lives after they were just like caught raping and murdering 100 Polish people. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Also, the Amazon review ends is a lot of dumb sentences, but it also calls them Nazi hillbilly Germans, which is awesome. It's so funny.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't even call them all hillbillies, to be honest with you, but, they were Nazis and they were evil, so fair enough.
Yeah, the hillbilly thing is, at least early on, a lot of the Nazis, right, were very metropolitan.
Actually, I mean, a lot of German Nazi ideology and, Austrian Nazi ideology did come from, rural, high German slash Southern German, Catholic orthodoxy and like the rules and stuff like that. Like authoritarianism, that's what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
So, like, in fact,
Kind of a
a lot of
natural
the
outgrowth of the orthodoxy that was already there.
exactly. Like a lot of the Protestant parts of Germany were actually very anti-Nazi. I mean, they were not anti-Nazi in the fact that they were communist, but they were more of the sort of reactionary conservatism of like classic German reactionary conservatism, like the imperial element of it, the
Yeah,
Kaiser and all
the
that.
loyalist.
Exactly. Whereas the Nazi element, once again, was from the more Catholic, more fascist, conservative elements of German society. So there is something to be said on that. And to be fair, like Austria and southern Germany were considered definitely the more, for lack of a better word, hillbilly rural parts of the German lands.
Probably, I guess, like, we're reading more into this word hillbilly than this reviewer clearly intended, but the parts of the country that were more rapidly alienated by industrialization too. So fascism is a misdirect of like class consciousness. It's very early kind of like primordial stage. So that's where you would have been seeing that, right? The more like labor kind of intensive parts of the country.
No, absolutely. All right. And then our last review here, Brian, is the one that I know we're going to probably have the most to say on. So our last review here is from Dimitri, who gives us 1 star. And the head of the review says, Soviet propaganda. And it's like, I don't know about that, Chief. I don't know about that. But either way, and this person, definitely their first language is not English. So I'm just going to it's like one paragraph long.
From Ukraine?
I think it's Ukrainian, I'm going to be honest with you, but once again, hold on to your asshole. So the body of the review says, crap of Soviet propaganda made to please Communist Party in 80s, when people started to realize that Soviet cruelty was worse than the Nazi one. Also objectively not true. That is objectively not true.
Not true.
Soviets killed 2 times more people in USSR than Nazis. That is also objectively not true.
Not true. Not true.
The only purpose of this movie is to channel attention to the horrors of war from the horrors of Stalin's dictatorship. That is also objectively not true. There is literally no truth.
By reformists.
In the 80s, in Perestroika and Glasnost. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Gorbachev had just replaced Andropov.
Exactly. Yeah, when this movie was released, that I think just happened. Like, during the production of it, there was definitely the gerontocracy years of the Soviet Union. But yeah, totally. When this movie came out, Gorbachev just came out. Like, this was a period of openness in Russia. That's the whole thing. Like, that's when all the most, like, hidden elements of the Stalinist, like, horror era came out to the forefront. So, like, saying that, like, that doesn't even make sense.
Guess what? Even in that 5-year stretch from Gorbachev taking over to the fall of the Soviet Union, guess what? A lot of the stuff that came out, even about the worst parts of the Soviet Union, turns out weren't as bad as we all assumed they were. There just isn't any record of it. There's no, like, liberated death camps like there were in Germany. There just isn't as much of it as we were led to believe there would be. It's just not there.
No,
it
it's just not there.
doesn't have to mean that they were good if you don't think they were. But it is not like they were so much worse than the Nazis. First of all, why do you even have to say that when you're talking about this movie? Why is that so important to you? That you're watching this and going, this movie is really, really making the Nazis look bad. I don't think it's fair. Fucking freak.
And also, just to be clear, once again, this person's name is fucking Dimitri. Come on, man. The Nazis aren't going to be friends with you. Let's be very clear here. Yeah, this guy's a fucking Azov battalion loser. Jesus fucking Christ. And this is like soft Holocaust denialism. At the very least, soft Holocaust denialism. So, to be clear, even though, once again, the Soviets definitely weren't perfect, I don't think anybody would ever fucking argue that. But yeah, there weren't death camps. There weren't fucking death camps. That's just objectively not true. Were there like purges? Were there mass killings? Were there fucking concentration camps?
Yeah.
Of course. But there weren't there was never a Soviet Auschwitz or a Soviet fucking even some of the less quote unquote bad concentration camps in Germany were still miles worse than even the worst fucking gulags. They just were.
I'm not saying this to be flippant about things that happened in the Soviet Union. There is no documentation. There is no evidence, it would seem, of camps where people were systematically murdered the way they were in Germany.
No, absolutely.
The other part is that this person's a dumbass. Because guess what? I watch all kinds of movies that I think are propaganda. And guess what? I can still think about them critically as movies. Which, let's not get too up our ass. That is ultimately what the show is supposed to be about. So I don't want to toot my own horn too much. But, this guy literally just watched this movie and saw that Nazis were the bad guys. And he was so mad.
Exactly. Mr. Dimitri / Azov commander himself was just like, how dare you say that about my favorite fucking Nazi war criminals? How dare you portray these people as bad? You cock! cock! You liberal
You
cock!
fucking these fucking liberal cocks, yeah.
You know, by the way,
He's
this
gonna go.
guy was absolutely a NAFO guy, 100%. You know that for a fucking
Oh yeah,
fact.
absolutely.
Which, by the
This
way,
guy was so
instantly,
mad he had to write a review of the movie. He had to go to the page and write about this because he was so upset.
exactly. Oh, by the way, interesting little tidbit. It's interesting that after USAID was dismantled, you haven't seen a lot of NAFO guys recently. Isn't it interesting? Oh, I haven't seen
Where'd
any
they
of
all
them in a
go?
long time. Where'd they go? Interesting. But speaking of NAFO and all of our favorite USAID funded friends, I think that ends our Amazon reviews and our synopsis here. Now, do we have any final thoughts before we go to our pluggables, Brian?
This is quite possibly the best war movie I've ever seen. And I like war movies. I like dumb, bad war movies. I like the war movies like we talked about that try to be anti-war but don't really succeed, like your First Bloods and your Full Metal Jackets. I like fucking Sands of Iwo Jima with John Wayne, which is a fucking evil movie, by the way. But as a movie, it's good. But this just in terms of like, almost feels trite to say it. A movie that is truly about war and about like the mental and physical degradation of war, the way it changes people and the way that it changes both individuals and the way it changes nations. I can't think of another movie that touches on that other than, like you said, Taylor, maybe Schindler's List as well as this does. I know that there's a whole type of person, believe me, my dad is one of them, who just likes war movies. And it's not always politicized, it's just like their preferred genre. If you are one of those people, you should see this movie. Because you might even, like our last reviewer, not like it. You might even be some weird reactionary and take offense to it. But you'll probably like the movie if you just watch it, because it's a good movie and it really does. It's just not a movie you would see made in the West. And maybe not a movie you'd ever see made outside of its time and place, actually.
No, absolutely, yeah. And I pretty much agree with everything you said. And I also do want to add too that even though I would agree this is easily the best, quote unquote, anti-war movie ever made. But like, I will say too that this is a movie that is, once again, as we mentioned, it's very bleak. It does show, pretty matter-of-factly a lot of the things that happened in World War II, especially in Belarus and stuff like that. So if that's the thing you don't want to see in your movie and you're not in the best headspace, I probably wouldn't recommend watching this. In fact, to be honest with you, there's not a whole lot of people in my personal life I would ever recommend this movie to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But this is a movie that if you're interested in seeing, once again, the degradation of war, the horrors that humanity are able to, put themselves in due to years of dehumanization of propaganda. If you want to see, obviously great examples of Soviet art, which of course there are many great examples of. I have a couple movies in my collection that show that. This is just a fantastic movie to show and maybe one of the best examples of Soviet filmmaking out there, along with movies like, Battleship Potemkin and stuff like that. And even like some of the more non-Soviet, like communist movies, like Cuban movies and stuff like that, that show, you talk about like Soviet realism and stuff like that. So that's something you're interested in, is seeing, non-Western, even obviously anti-Western art to a certain extent that has artistic merit. This is definitely a movie I would recommend. But yeah, I would definitely say you should probably be in the right headspace to watch this, because if you're depressed and not feeling good, I probably wouldn't recommend watching this movie. I'll be totally honest with you.
I mean, it's not a fun movie. It's a heavy film. Also, like we said, there are some surrealist elements. I do think it's very entertaining, and it's actually fairly accessible for how heavy it is. But yeah, it's not a thing I would just flip on to chill out.
Yeah, this isn't the movie that you watch with your girl cuddling up and expecting to fucking Netflix and chill. I'll just be honest with you. But either way, so yes, that is the end of our review here. So let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe and follow us on both of our YouTube and our Spotify pages, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert are creating a fantastic series. They are currently in pre-production for creating that series. There's already episode 1 out on YouTube. And as well as we've mentioned on many episodes now, they have a GoFundMe, which, I believe it's a GoFundMe. And I believe they're about a quarter of the way through their GoFundMe at the moment, but either way, they need our moral and financial support to continue to get their series off the ground. And of course, as our pledge to you has been now for months and months and months, if you donate to
years
the campaign,
at this point, I think, actually.
I think so, honestly, yeah. Just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just, show us that you donate to the campaign. We will, within reason, about $20-25 match those donations, because of course we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to become a reality. Now, Brian, do you have any updates?
No, they're still in pre-production. They're just fleshing out the script. As we say before, the concept for Lucifer and the Father is quite ambitious. They are trying to do a pretty heady, sort of pseudo-anthology series. Very independent, very modestly budgeted. So they want to really optimize that script, make sure it's really good. Last I had heard from Scott, they had to take a break just from work for just a couple weeks. Sean had he had to go to the hospital, but nothing real serious. I think he stepped on a toothpick, but he couldn't walk for a couple days, for a couple weeks or something. So that was the last I'd heard. But yeah, I think they're just tightening up the script, and they are still aiming for, what did I say last time? Was it like the end of September was their shooting date that they were aiming towards, I think?
Yes, I believe that you mentioned that on the last episode, I believe.
Whatever I said on the last episode is what it is.
Perfect. Excellent. And we're very excited to obviously see future episodes of that series. And then, Brian, obviously we reviewed a movie about a freedom fighter fighting for our freedoms. Well, this person who is being railroaded and didn't do it. But either way, we of course want to talk about Luigi Mangione, the alleged United Healthcare CEO shooter. Of course, he's being, railroaded by prosecutors. We once again believe he's innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. There's been a lot of judicial misconduct in this case, but of course he has an official crowdfund now. I believe last time I checked, it's at like $1.5 million or something like that. Like, it's crazy.
And the thing is, it's tempting to get really excited about that. Is very exciting. It's a great show of solidarity. They are going to need every penny of that. Please do not hesitate to donate more if you are inclined to do so, or if you're able to do so. Do not stop talking about it. I know that this is a great sign, and it's great that so many people are turning out for Luigi. I know Taylor and I both have. He really is getting fucked over by them. They are really trying to pin this on him, and he is going to need every cent of that money. I guarantee it.
No, absolutely. And to be clear, it is the Luigi Mangione Official Legal Fund, or the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund, as I believe is originally called. And it's actually 1.1 million, but its goal at the moment is 1.5 million. So that's where I was confused. But either way, it is raised over $1 million. So clearly people very much believe in this campaign. And, just like with the Lucifer and the Father campaign, just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just show us you donated, and we will, within reason, match those donations. Until the show becomes insanely popular, then we probably won't be able to match those. But either way, at the very moment, the one or two people that may listen to this and actually donate because of us, we will match those donations because we can afford that very easily. But if it's like 500, we'll probably have to put a stop on that. And then, of course, we have a Patreon page. So, it's one of those things where we are small-time creators trying to create a fantastic series and continue on financially with our show, of course. We have several tiers on there. I don't believe we have any patrons at the moment, but either way, please be our first patron. We've been plugging very much our first tier, which is the $5 tier, which is where you get every episode of our show released 48 hours early, because as I always say, the first 48 hours are the most important. So please donate or I should say, please become a patron of our Patreon today. You will get at least 2 to 4 episodes a month, so that's about $2.50, $2.25 an episode. That's a crazy deal. Folks, that's a crazy deal. We're the best deal makers.
You don't want to lose money on this, guys.
You really don't. Folks, we make the art of the deal here at Millennials Are Old, aka Mao.
Yeah, step into our office.
Exactly. We are the Teflon Dons of the podcast world.
Yeah. Follow us at our social media. That's Millennials Are Old Pod at Instagram and Threads. That remains the most consistent way. If you want to harass us about the show, if you want to give us feedback, if you want to cyberbully me, that is probably the best way to do it. It's Millennials Are Old Pod, all one word. There's also the Facebook page where we document various boomers. I gotta say, the Billy Jack Facebook group has been eerily quiet, so I might have to go in there and start poking around, because I'm worried about the guys. We love them. We love our base libs, and we love the weird Republicans that somehow always say, I wish we could just keep politics out of Billy Jack.
The famous apolitical series, Billy Jack.
I know we said it a million times during the Billy Jack series. The thing that makes those movies good, the thing that makes them interesting is the politics. And I love those movies. I'm not talking shit. If you aren't interested in Tom Laughlin's politics, there's no reason to watch them.
No, there is absolutely motherfucking not. So, yeah, once again, we feel for the Billy Jack guys. I hope they're not on any kind of suicide watch or anything. I hope they're doing all right. But either way, yeah, definitely, I cannot wait until we continue on with the final part of our Billy Jack series, for sure, because there's still one more part in us. I know that for a fact. There's still one more part.
Well, there is one more, and there is lots of ancillary Tom Laughlin material that we can visit if we ever want to. If we ever have more Tom Laughlin in our system to get out, there's The Lone Gunfighter, there's a play that he wrote and started in the 60s that was made into a TV film. There's some stuff, there's, if we wanted to continue to mine that well, we can.
No, absolutely. There is so much Tom Laughlin lore, if you will.
To be honest, I'm a pretty big Tom Laughlin fan, and I've looked around for other in-depth podcasts analyzing the movies, analyzing that. We might kind of be the foremost, like, younger Tom Laughlin documenters.
We're the Lostorians.
I mean,
the Tom Storians.
Kind of. I think we've done the most thorough analysis, the most thorough and even-handed analysis of Billy Jack, for sure.
I think so, legitimately. All right, so
another reason to donate to our Patreon.
Exactly, 100%. All right, so that is our review for this week. And Brian, the title of this film came from the Book of Revelations. And you know what? I have a revelation tonight, Brian, is that I want to see myself in the bed soon and come to a revelation that I will be dreaming soon. And I will, in my dream, see a pale horse. That's the best I could do, because Beyond a Pale Horse is also
Bill
from that
Cooper
exact...
over here.
Yeah, exactly. Is that from that same Revelations segment where Come and See is from. So a pretty famous part of the Revelations, whatever. But either way, that was my best. So have a good night, everybody. Well, sleep tight. And Flyora, definitely shoot every Nazi you can find. Kill Hitler in your brain. I think we can agree with that. Kill Hitler in your brain and fall asleep tonight.
If you are having any problems dealing with your trauma, our DMs are always open.
Yeah, 100%. But don't trauma dump on us either, because those kids these days, they love trauma dumping.
Because really, I'm going through a lot myself, and I don't really have that many spoons, and I'd love to be able to be here and to listen to your problems, but I'm just really not up for it right now.
Exactly, so have a good night, everybody.